Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are diving deep into the life and work of a true titan of English literature, John Dryden. But we aren't just going to look at him as a brilliant writer or England's first official poet laureate. No, we're examining him as the ultimate survivor. This guy was a fascinating shapeshifter who managed to navigate one of the absolute most turbulent periods in British history, the Restoration Age. He actually dominated it so completely that people often just call this whole period the Age of Dryden. So, how exactly did he survive decades of chaotic political and religious upheaval? Well, by constantly adapting.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to break down Dryden's massive bibliography chronologically. We'll cover the era of the Chameleon, mastering the English stage, miracles, fire and tragedy, the master of satire, and finally, a laureate's final act. Let's see how his writing evolved in lockstep with English history.
Starting with Chapter 1, the era of the Chameleon.
To really understand Dryden, we have to understand his incredible ability to pivot. In an era where backing the wrong political leader could literally cost you your head, he basically mastered the literary flip-flop. The speed of his shifting allegiances is just staggering. Think about this. In 1658, right in the middle of Puritan rule, Dryden writes heroic stanzas. It's this heartfelt, glowing eulogy celebrating the achievements of the Puritan Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Yet fast forward literally 2 years to 1660, the Puritan era abruptly ends, the monarchy is restored. And what does Dryden do? He immediately writes Astrea Redux, a poem passionately celebrating the return of King Charles II. And a year after that, he's penning the official panegyric for the king's coronation. He went from praising the Puritan ruler to cheering for the restored monarch at lightning speed.
Now, history often asks, was he just a massive hypocrite? Well, the legendary critic Samuel Johnson brilliantly defended Dryden. He said, if he changed with the nation. And that's absolutely crucial context. England itself was undergoing massive traumatic shifts from a monarchy to a republic and then back again. So Dryden's flip-flopping wasn't necessarily just simple disloyalty. It was an act of national survival. He was giving the country the stability and the celebration it desperately demanded in that exact moment.
Moving on to Chapter 2. Mastering the English stage.
Okay, so it's 1660. The monarchy is back and the theaters, which had been completely banned and boarded up by the Puritans, finally reopen. Dryden, ever the pragmatist, realizes playwriting is suddenly the most lucrative gig in town. So he throws himself into it, producing this massive output over the next 2 decades. He didn't start strong, though. His very first attempt in 1663, a prose comedy called The Wild Gallant, was a total flop. In fact, the famous diarist Samuel Pepys actually noted it was the worst play he had ever seen in his life. Ouch. But Dryden learned fast. He bounced back, collaborated on major hits like The Indian Queen, and churned out highly successful comedies like Secret Love and Sir Martin Marall.
And those early hits actually illustrate a really common historical misconception about his work. When you hear titles like The Indian Queen and its sequel, The Indian Emperor, you naturally assume they were set in India, right? Nope. They are actually set in Mexico and Peru, focusing entirely on the Aztec and Inca empires. If you want Dryden's actual take on India, you have to look at Aurangzeb, which is a tragedy based directly on the contemporary Mughal emperor of India.
Here is a brilliant bit of trivia. Almost all of Dryden's plays were rigidly written in rhyming heroic couplets. That was his signature. But All for Love, his famous 1677 retelling of the Antony and Cleopatra story, is the one and only play he ever wrote in unrhymed blank verse. He stepped completely out of his comfort zone, leaving his usual rhyming structure behind, specifically to imitate Shakespeare's style and pay homage to the great bard.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, Miracles, Fire, and Tragedy. Just as Dryden is really hitting his theatrical stride, the mid-1660s bring catastrophic events to London. First, the Great Plague sweeps through. And then there's this number, 13,200. That is the devastating number of houses destroyed during the Great Fire of London in 1666. The fire raged out of control for 5 straight days, wiping out massive swaths of the entire city. With the city in ruins, theaters were forced to close for public safety, meaning Dryden couldn't write plays. So what does a pragmatic writer do when his primary source of income simply vanishes? He writes about the moment.
He channels all that energy into 2 major works. First, he writes Annus Mirabilis, which translates to The Year of Miracles. Now, you might expect a poem of despair about a devastating fire, but it's actually a celebration of London's incredible survival and resilience. It beautifully portrays the king effectively rebuilding the city. At the exact same time, he writes an essay of dramatic poesy. This is a brilliant prose dialogue where a group of characters fiercely debate the merits of drama. And interestingly enough, one of the characters, named Neander, directly represents Dryden himself, passionately defending English drama as a legitimate and high art form.
Now for Chapter 4, The Master of Satire.
The 1680s roll around. The theaters are finally open again, but the political climate in England is incredibly volatile. This is the era of the Popish plot, a terrifying time of intense religious paranoia and outright political warfare over who will succeed King Charles II. Dryden steps directly onto the battlefield to support the king by writing what is widely considered the greatest political satire in all of English literature, Absalom and Achitophel. Let's decode this brilliant allegory. He takes a well-known biblical story and maps it perfectly onto contemporary politics. In the poem, King David represents Charles II. Absalom is the Duke of Monmouth, the king's handsome but illegitimate son. And Achitophel represents Lord Shaftesbury, the anti-Catholic rebel leader who is manipulating the son to rebel against his father. By dressing up highly sensitive current events in biblical robes, Dryden could mercilessly mock the king's enemies while keeping just enough plausible deniability to avoid direct censorship. It was a masterstroke.
But listen, his satire definitely wasn't just reserved for high-level politicians. He absolutely targeted his literary rivals, too. Enter the poem Macfleck No. Dryden had this legendary, fiercely petty feud with a Protestant Whig poet named Thomas Shadwell. They disagreed on politics, they disagreed on literature, and frankly, Dryden had had enough. In this biting 1682 poem, he sarcastically crowned Shadwell as the undisputed heir to an empire of dullness. He literally immortalizes him as the prophet of tautology, meaning someone who just repeats the same useless, boring things over and over again. It is an absolutely brutal, hilarious literary takedown.
Let's move to our final chapter, A Laureate's Final Act. As we push into the late 1680s, Dryden's chameleon-like adaptability faces its absolute ultimate and most dramatic test yet. First, in 1682, he writes a poem called Religio Laici, passionately and publicly defending the Protestant Anglican Church. But just 3 years later, King Charles II dies, and his brother, King James II, takes the throne. Now, James is a strict Catholic, so what does our chameleon do? He promptly converts to Catholicism. He justifies this massive shift by writing The Hind and the Panther in 1687. It's an elaborate poem where a beautiful milk-white hind represents his brand-new Catholic faith, while a spotted, dangerous panther represents the Anglican Church he just left behind.
But then, in 1688, the music finally stops. The Glorious Revolution takes place. The Catholic King James II is ousted, and the Protestant monarchs William and Mary are brought in to rule the country. Everyone naturally expects Dryden to just pivot again, to write a brand new poem praising the Protestants, like he always does. But astonishingly, he doesn't. He outright refuses to take the oath of allegiance to the new monarchs, boldly stating he will remain loyal to the exiled King James II.
And the consequences of that stand are immediate. For his refusal, Dryden is officially dismissed from his highly prestigious post as poet laureate. He loses his title, and importantly, he loses his royal pension. But the historical irony of this moment is just magnificent. Do you know who the new Protestant monarchs chose to replace him as poet laureate? Thomas Shadwell. Yes, the exact same enemy Dryden had mercilessly mocked as the prophet of tautology in his satire, now literally had his job.
Suddenly stripped of his royal income, the aging Dryden is forced to return to his pragmatic roots just to survive. He focuses heavily on translating classic works in the English to make a living, publishing the highly successful collection Fables, Ancient and Modern. He also continues to compose genuinely brilliant poetry, including the magnificent ode Alexander's Feast, or The Power of Music, in 1697. He really proved that even without a royal title or a pension, his pen was as sharp and powerful as it ever was.
Which brings us to a final, really provocative question. Was John Dryden just an opportunistic chameleon who easily changed his morals to suit his wallet? Or was he a brilliant, pragmatic survivor holding up a mirror to one of the most turbulent ages in all of British history? Whatever you decide, there's absolutely no denying that his ability to adapt his genius to the moment left an indelible, lasting mark on literature. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.